It was supposed to be another calm morning on CBS Mornings. Fresh coffee, warm smiles, and polite conversation. But when Prince Harry took his seat across from Tony Dokoupil, the air in the studio shifted. What started as a courteous chat turned into one of the most uncomfortable interviews the show had ever seen. One that would end with Harry storming off the set, leaving stunned hosts in silence behind. The CBS Morning studio gleamed with soft daylight spilling through Manhattan's skyline. Tony Dokoupil, known for his calm demeanor and easy charm, straightened his notes as cameras rolled. "Good morning, America," he greeted with his signature composure. "And good morning to our special guest, Prince Harry." The Duke gave a faint smile, nodding. His posture was impeccable, his gaze steady, a man used to being watched. "Pleasure to be here," he said flatly, though his tone carried little warmth. Tony chuckled politely. "We appreciated you taking the time. Let's start simple. How's life in California treating you?" Harry leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "It's peaceful," he replied, pausing just long enough to sound insincere. "You know, when you've spent your life surrounded by chaos, you start to appreciate silence, even if some people mistake it for isolation." Tony nodded thoughtfully. "I get that. You've traded royal duties for a quieter life, right? What's a typical morning like for you and your family?" Harry smirked. "I'm not sure typical applies to me, Tony. My mornings aren't about routines. They're about freedom, something not everyone's had the courage to chase." Tony's co-host smiled faintly, shifting in her chair, sensing the subtle tension. Tony continued carefully. "Freedom is a powerful word. Do you ever miss certain aspects of royal life? Tradition, duty, connection?" Harry's lips curved upward, but his eyes stayed cold. "Duty is just a word people use when they want to control you. Tradition is the rope they tie around your neck while smiling for the cameras." The studio air thinned. Tony's hand hovered over his cue cards. "That's quite a statement," he said softly. "But your family, your father, they'd say duty is what gives their lives purpose." "Purpose?" Harry scoffed, voice sharp enough to cut glass. "My family's purpose has always been survival, image management, the illusion of service wrapped in designer suits and press releases." Tony exchanged a quick glance with his co-host. He cleared his throat, still calm. "All right, well, you've built your own image since leaving. Documentaries, your book, public speeches. You've been busy. What drives you now?" Harry's smirk returned. "Truth," he said simply, "and independence. You see, Tony, I don't have to ask anyone's permission to speak anymore. That's what terrifies them." Tony smiled politely, though his eyes flickered with mild disbelief. "So you feel you've been silenced in the past?" Harry leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Silenced, manipulated, framed. Take your pick. The monarchy runs on whispers and headlines. I just stopped playing the game." Tony hesitated before moving on. "You mentioned family earlier. I have to ask, how are things now between you and your brother?" For the first time, Harry's jaw tightened. "That's private," he said curtly. "But I'll say this. Some relationships don't survive when truth enters the room." The host's tone softened. "Fair enough. And Meghan, she's been under tremendous scrutiny too. How do you two handle that pressure together?" Harry gave a low laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Handle? We don't handle it. We rise above it. People underestimate her. She's not just a royal wife. She's a woman with purpose. Maybe that's what unsettles the world. A woman who refuses to bow." Tony nodded again, trying to keep the tone light. "There's been talk, purely speculation, about new projects with Netflix? Perhaps a new season of your series?" Harry shot him a look that could freeze a room. "Speculation," he repeated, the word heavy with disdain. "That's your world, Tony. Mine is reality." Tony chuckled lightly. "Just doing my job." Harry leaned back. "Your job seems to involve asking about money and gossip. Maybe you should try asking about meaning once in a while." The tension was now unmistakable. Tony's co-host gently interjected, "We're just curious about what's next for you both. Viewers love hearing about growth and family." "Viewers love drama," Harry interrupted. "That's what keeps shows like this alive, isn't it?" For a moment, the studio fell silent. Even the cameras seemed to hum quieter. Tony glanced toward the control room, then back at his guest with a polite but restrained smile. Well, he said slowly, we try to focus on perspective, not spectacle. Harry gave a dry laugh. Perspective is just spectacle with better lighting. Tony smiled through it, but his grip on the table edge tightened slightly. The morning show had suddenly turned into something far less friendly. The lights in the CBS Morning studio felt a little harsher after the break. The hum of the cameras was louder now, or maybe it was just the silence between questions. Tony Dokoupil adjusted his posture, his voice smooth as ever. We're back with Prince Harry, continuing our conversation about his life, his work, and what's next for him and his family. Harry gave a brief nod, the faintest trace of a smirk tugging at his lips. Yes, always good to be dissected publicly, he said dryly. Tony chuckled softly. We'll try not to dissect too much. Let's talk about your work. You've spoken about mental health and the importance of emotional honesty. Do you feel that message has been heard the way you intended? Harry leaned forward, fingers interlocked, his gaze steady but sharp. I think people hear what they want to hear. Some people nod along because it's fashionable to care about mental health now. Others dismiss it because it's easier to mock a prince than to face their own pain. That's fair, Tony said evenly. But critics have pointed out that your interviews often turn into, how should I put this, confessions mixed with accusations. They say you sound angry. Do you think that's a fair assessment? Harry's eyes narrowed slightly. Anger is what people call truth when it makes them uncomfortable. Tony nodded slowly. But sometimes the way truth is delivered affects how it's received, doesn't it? Harry gave a thin smile. You mean I should smile more while talking about being hunted by tabloids? Maybe at a joke? Tony smiled, trying to match his tone. You're talking to a morning show host. I'm all for a little humor. Harry didn't laugh. Humor is the privilege of people who've never been chased through tunnels or vilified in headlines, Tony. The words hit the air like a cold gust. Tony's co-host, sitting nearby, shot him a look as if to say, careful now. But Tony held his ground, his tone steady. I'm sorry if any of my questions feel intrusive. It's not my intention. But when you publish a book, release a documentary, and speak openly about family dynamics, don't you also open the door to public curiosity? Harry leaned back, a slight scoff escaping him. Public curiosity is just voyeurism with better PR. You're all desperate to peek through the window, and then you act offended when I close the curtains. Tony paused, letting the silence stretch before responding softly. That's an interesting metaphor. But for the record, I don't think curiosity and intrusion are always the same thing. Viewers care about your story, do they? Harry shot back. Or do they just enjoy watching a royal rebel burn bridges? Tony exhaled slowly, still smiling politely. You might be surprised, actually. I think many people want to see you happy. Harry's laugh was short, sharp. People want to feel like they're supporting something noble, Tony. It's emotional consumerism. Buy a cause, feel better about yourself. Isn't that a little cynical? Cynicism is realism with better vocabulary, Harry replied instantly. Tony blinked, the first hint of irritation crossing his face. He straightened in his chair, shifting his cards. All right, he said, his tone tightening just a fraction. Let's pivot then. There's been a lot of speculation about your partnership with Netflix. Some say the new season of your docuseries might be delayed due to creative differences. And there were reports you and Meghan were asking for a higher production fee. Any truth to that? Harry's jaw flexed. I'm amazed by how obsessed the media is with money that isn't theirs. Tony smiled lightly. So that's a no? Harry's response was laced with mockery. That's a none of your business, Tony. Tony chuckled, trying to diffuse. Fair enough. You know, I asked because people are curious. People are nosy, Harry interrupted. Let's call things what they are. Tony's co-host interjected softly. We're just exploring the story from all angles, Prince Harry. Nothing personal. Everything is personal when your name sells headlines, Harry replied sharply. Tony placed his cards flat on the table, his voice still calm but firmer now. Then let's take headlines out of it. Let's talk about you. About where you see yourself 5 years from now. Harry tilted his head, his smirk returning. 5 years from now, I'll still be doing what I do best, forcing people like you to ask better questions. The studio went quiet. Tony's co-host blinked, unsure whether to laugh or move on. Tony gave a slow nod, his tone clipped. All right, I'll take that as motivation. Harry leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was creating. You should. A little introspection never hurt anyone. Tony's professionalism began to fray ever so slightly at the edges. Let's talk about your mother, if that's okay, he began gently. You've said she's your inspiration, that she taught you empathy. Do you think she'd be proud of how outspoken you have become? Harry's smile faded. For a moment, there was a flicker of emotion. Then it hardened. My mother would understand. She knew what it meant to be misunderstood. Tony nodded slowly. And do you ever worry about being misunderstood yourself? Harry's tone turned cold. I don't worry about opinions from people who only understand headlines. The tension was thick now, the kind of silence that felt electric, heavy, unblinking. Tony took a breath, adjusting his notes again, his patience visibly thinning. All right, he said softly. You've mentioned that you value privacy and authenticity. Do you think doing multiple high-profile interviews helps or hurts that goal? Harry's response came like a snap of a whip. Privacy isn't silence, Tony. It's control. I decide what I share. That's the difference between me and the media circus. Tony nodded, tone even, but firm. That's a fair point. But do you think there's a balance between controlling your story and overexposing it? Harry leaned forward, his tone dripping with condescension. Balance is a word people use when they're too scared to pick a side. The co-host glanced nervously toward the director's booth. Tony forced a calm smile. That's certainly one way to look at it. But as the segment ended, the atmosphere in the studio was heavy. No one laughing, no one exhaling. The tension was building like a storm over calm waters. And Tony Dokoupil, usually unshakable, was starting to lose his patience. The cameras rolled again after another brief commercial break. The transition music faded and Tony Dokoupil's practiced morning smile returned to his face. But behind it, his composure was thinning, stretched taut like a rubber band on the verge of snapping. Across from him, Prince Harry lounged slightly in his chair, exuding an air of superiority that now filled the entire studio. Welcome back to CBS Mornings, Tony began, his tone steady but slightly cooler. We're continuing our conversation with Prince Harry, discussing his new projects and, of course, his ongoing relationship with the public eye. Harry nodded with a restrained smirk. That's a polite way of saying controversy, isn't it? Tony chuckled politely. You could say that. Though I think most people are just curious. After all, you've managed to reinvent yourself several times since leaving the royal family. Would you say you've found peace now? Harry's lips twitched into something between a grin and a sneer. Peace is a funny word, Tony. It's usually used by people who've never had to fight for their own identity. Tony nodded, jotting something on his notepad. That's fair. Though some might say you've been fighting against ghosts, institutions, traditions, expectations. Do you ever feel like you're still running from something? Harry's eyes hardened. Running. I'd call it escaping. There's a difference. Running implies fear. Escaping means liberation. That's an interesting distinction, Tony replied calmly. But in escaping, do you think you've perhaps alienated people who once supported you? People who supported me? Harry repeated, leaning forward, his tone sharp. You mean the tabloids? The same ones that tore my mother apart? Or maybe the royal establishment that let it happen? Tony lifted a hand slightly, trying to diffuse the intensity. I mean the public. People who admired your family, who grew up watching you. Harry gave a hollow laugh. Admiration is just obsession with better lighting. The same people who adore you today will destroy you tomorrow if it sells. Tony's expression remained composed, but his voice grew firmer. Do you think that cynicism makes it harder for people to relate to you? Harry's tone turned icy. I'm not here to be relatable. I'm here to be real. There was a pause, that kind of silence that made every camera operator shift uncomfortably in their seat. Tony took a breath and continued. You've talked before about wanting to protect your family from the same kind of media intrusion that affected your mother. Yet you've done multiple documentaries, interviews, books. Do you see how some people might find that contradictory? Harry's eyes narrowed. Contradictory? Number. Hypocrisy would be pretending to care about truth while profiting off lies. I think you'd know something about that. Tony blinked. It was subtle, but for the first time, his practiced morning host composure faltered. That's an interesting accusation, he said softly. But I'll remind you that I'm not the one being interviewed here. Harry gave a dismissive shrug. Maybe you should be. Tony smiled tightly, but the warmth was gone. All right, he said slowly, voice lower now. Let's talk about Megan. You've both faced criticism, some of it unfair, no doubt, but others say your actions have created much of that attention. Do you ever reflect on your role in that dynamic? Harry leaned forward, voice brimming with arrogance. You mean, do I take responsibility for existing? For being visible? For daring to speak when it's more comfortable for everyone if I stay quiet? Tony shook his head gently. No, I mean, for how you've handled the attention. For example, when you describe your own family publicly in interviews like this one, it invites reaction. Harry smirked. Maybe if the truth didn't bother them, they wouldn't react. Tony exhaled slowly, visibly losing patience. You know, I've interviewed a lot of high-profile figures, Prince Harry, but few seem as determined to turn every question into a confrontation. Harry's tone dripped with sarcasm. Maybe you're just not used to people challenging your shallow assumptions. A low murmur rippled through the production crew behind the cameras. Tony's co-host glanced nervously from offstage, clearly unsure whether to intervene. Tony's smile disappeared completely now. I think we're just trying to have a civil conversation, he said firmly. That's what this platform is about. Harry folded his arms, leaning back. Civil? You mean scripted. You ask what you think people want to hear, and when I don't play along, you call it rude. Tony sat back as well, his voice controlled but colder now. No, I call it defensive. There's a difference. Harry tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. Or maybe I'm just not interested in your tabloid-friendly framing. Tony nodded slowly. Right. Because asking about your life, the one you've made public through a dozen interviews in a memoir, is now off limits? Harry's tone sharpened further. There's a difference between sharing my story on my terms and being dissected by people pretending to care. Tony's voice finally lost its softness. And yet, you chose to come here, didn't you? No one forced you to sit in that chair. The air in the studio grew heavy, like static before lightning. Harry's jaw tightened. Maybe I thought this was going to be a real conversation. Not another ambush disguised as empathy, Tony's co-host called from off-camera. We can take a quick break if needed. Tony waved it off, his eyes still locked on Harry. No, I think our viewers deserve honesty. You talk about empathy, Prince Harry, but the way you speak to people, especially those who try to give you a platform, doesn't exactly reflect it. Harry gave a cold laugh. Maybe you confuse empathy with obedience. Tony leaned forward slightly, voice quiet but cutting. And maybe you confuse honesty with arrogance. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the faint hum of the studio equipment seemed to vanish. For the first time, Harry looked genuinely caught off guard. His lips parted slightly, as though ready to fire back. But nothing came. The atmosphere was crackling now, tense and raw. Tony straightened his notes again, his professional calm returning like armor. We'll continue this conversation after the break, he said tightly, looking straight at the camera. The red recording light dimmed. Harry stood up abruptly, rubbing his temples, muttering something under his breath. Tony remained seated, staring at his notes but not reading them. The silence between them was louder than anything they had said on air. And everyone in that studio, from the sound engineers to the producers, knew the next segment wouldn't just be tense. It was going to explode. When the cameras came back on, the tension was already palpable. The lights felt hotter, the air heavier. Tony Dokoupil sat upright, his pen tapping against his notepad, while Prince Harry returned to his seat with a look of quiet defiance, like a man who'd decided the conversation was a battle to be won, not a dialogue to be had. "Welcome back to CBS Mornings," Tony said, forcing a polite tone. "We've been speaking with Prince Harry about life, family, and the realities of public scrutiny. Let's pick up where we left off." Harry crossed one leg over the other, leaning back with his hands clasped. "Sure, Tony, but let's be clear. This isn't really a conversation. It's you trying to frame me the way the media always has." Tony's jaw flexed, but his voice stayed measured. "I'm simply asking questions." "That's my job," Harry smirked. "Right. And my job, apparently, is to sit here while you try to twist everything into a headline." Tony gave a short laugh, not of amusement but disbelief. "Prince Harry, you've given dozens of interviews like this. You've written books, done podcasts, documentaries. Are you saying everyone else got it wrong too?" Harry's eyes flashed. "I'm saying everyone else wanted to get it wrong, because angry prince sells better than man who left a broken system." Tony leaned forward. "So everyone's the problem except you?" Harry's voice rose slightly, his aristocratic accent sharpening. "I didn't come here to be psychoanalyzed, Tony. If you want gossip, go call my brother. He's good at smiling for cameras." Tony's co-host shifted nervously off-screen. The control room whispered into his earpiece, "Stay calm, keep going, don't lose him." Tony ignored it. "Let's talk about your family then," he said softly. "Your relationship with your father, is there any communication these days?" Harry gave a bitter chuckle. "We've So you can run another headline about a fractured royal bond? My family had decades to care. They didn't." Tony sighed, his patience thinning. "I'm not asking to stir drama. I'm asking because people are genuinely curious if there's hope for reconciliation." Harry snapped, "The public's curiosity is not my responsibility." There was a long pause. Tony stared at him, then set his notepad down slowly. His tone turned firm, still calm but no longer soft. "You know, Harry," he said, "you talk a lot about wanting privacy, but you've built an entire brand on staying in the spotlight. It's hard to claim you're escaping the media when you keep walking into interviews like this." Harry froze for a moment, his jaw clenching. "So now you're questioning my integrity?" Tony met his glare evenly. "No, I'm questioning your consistency." Harry laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "You journalists all think you're so clever, don't you? As if asking the same recycled questions makes you profound." Tony's pen snapped in his hand, literally. A small click echoed through the studio. He set the broken pen aside, exhaling sharply through his nose. "Look," he said, "I've interviewed world leaders, soldiers, scientists, people who've faced pressure you couldn't imagine, and yet none of them talk down to people the way you do." Harry's smirk vanished. "Excuse me?" Tony's tone hardened, his words deliberate now. "You act like the world owes you sympathy, Harry. Like you're the only one who's ever had a rough life. But you've lived in palaces, traveled on private jets, had every door opened for you, and still you sit here, sneering at anyone who dares ask a question." The studio went dead quiet. The sound engineer's finger hovered over the mute button, unsure if they were about to witness career suicide or television gold. Harry straightened up, his face reddening. "You think money or privilege protects anyone from trauma? You think you can just measure pain by access?" Tony shot back instantly. "No, but I think gratitude should come with it." Harry's eyes widened in disbelief. "Gratitude? For what, Tony? For being born into a cage painted gold?" Tony leaned forward slightly. "For having a platform and using it to inspire instead of insult." Harry stood abruptly. The chair legs scraped loudly against the floor. "This interview is over." Tony didn't flinch. "Of course it is." Harry glared down at him, breathing heavily. "You don't understand a thing about me." Tony replied calmly, "Maybe not. But after today, a lot of people understand you better than they ever did." For a moment, Harry looked as though he might say something more. A comeback, a final word. But then he simply turned and stormed off set, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The camera operators exchanged uncertain glances. Tony adjusted his tie, looked directly into the camera, and spoke with professional steadiness. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, we apologize for the abrupt end to that interview. Our goal here at CBS Mornings is to foster open and respectful dialogue, but sometimes that's not always possible. He hesitated just a beat, then added quietly, thank you for watching. The red light on the camera went off. Tony exhaled deeply, his composure breaking for just a second. His co-host walked in, eyes wide. That was something. Tony gave a small, tired smile. Yeah, something tells me that clip's going to be everywhere by noon. But inside that studio, Tony Dokoupil just sat quietly in his chair, rubbing his temples. Because no matter how viral it went, he couldn't shake one thought. He had just looked a prince in the eyes and seen a man completely lost in his own crown. If you enjoyed this unbelievable story, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more explosive interviews and shocking behind-the-scenes moments from television history. What did you think of Harry's reaction? Was Tony right to call him out, or did things go too far? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss the next dramatic episode we uncover.